welcome to the third MNKOM lunch this semester, which is about communicating climate change. My name is Mjaaland, and I'm going to be the moderator. First, I will tell you a bit about the concept of MNKOM. The MNKOM course is a science communication course held every spring here at the University of Oslo. Around 30 bachelor and master students learn how to use communication as an instrument to reach out to the public and use their knowledge in society. The MNKOM lunch is an extension of this course, and there will be 3 more MNKOM lunches this spring. The 25th of April, Dag Hessen, Anna Blix, Hauk Are Fjell, and Axel Bronsteri will talk about the natural scientist and the society. The 2nd of May, Svein Stølen, Morten Irgens, and Per Olav Skjervold will talk about how to educate good research communicators together with moderator Norit Ekbo. And on the 9th of May, Jan Ole Hesselberg, one of the creators of Folkeopplysningen, will share his best tips on how to communicate science. All the lectures will be filmed, and you can find them on the Science Library's YouTube channel and on titan.uio.no. So back to today's conversation. In today's panel, we have Angela Morelli and Bjørn Samset and Espen Larsen. Angela Morelli is an award-winning Italian information designer based in Norway. She's a CEO and co-founder of Info Design Lab. She gained her MA in communication design from Central St. Martin's, where she specialized in information design. Angela is passionate about working with research organizations to design science. She serves as an ambassador for virtual water and water footprint research and was named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. Bjørn Samset is a climate scientist and is currently leading the science group at CICERO. He's a physicist and has previously worked with particle and nuclear physics. He's also an active promoter of science, physics, and knowledge about climate change, and has been active in the Norwegian media for over 10 years. Espen Larsen is a communication advisor from the Norwegian Environment Agency and have collaborated with Angela on a project where they wanted to make a best practice guide for scientists on how to make better and more understandable visual graphics for people. So, numbers, facts, and gray graphs have seemingly no effects on the public. Since we started gathering the evidence of climate change, little has happened to our own habits and actions. In many ways, the project of communicating climate change has been a huge flop. So, today we're talking about what has happened and why it is so difficult to talk about and understanding climate change. So, Angela, why don't you start about telling us about your work?
Yeah. I'm actually very passionate about understanding in general because, as you said, I'm a CEO and co-founder of Info Design Lab, and we empower people and organizations to communicate complex information in beautiful narrative and meaningful messages and understandable messages, especially. I have a comment about, I hear a lot about the flop of science communication and the failure of science communication, and I kind of like react to it because I think it's partly wrong to put it that way. I think that the world evolves constantly, and data evolves constantly, and the tools we use to communicate evolve constantly, and we are just trying out different techniques and different and different ways of trying to fulfill our task, which is not, of course, an easy one. One thing that is very relevant to what you do in Info Design Lab is to try to remember that in general, effective science communication has a very strong social component. Okay, so if you want to achieve, if you want to design effective communication, you cannot ignore the social aspect of it. And that's when the failure kicks in, if we ignore the social aspect of it. Okay, so I believe that we should kind of embrace a more multidimensional view of science communication, and we should take into account the social aspect of human interactions, because designing science effectively, it doesn't mean that you wrap the information in a beautiful dress and you put it on someone's doorstep. It doesn't work that way. You have to use a human-centered approach. That's why I think information design is very powerful, because it's very human-centered. So our approach is to, first of all, co-design with scientists. You cannot become as expert as the scientist. You must co-design with them. They are the real expert. And then you have to co-design with the audience you're trying to address your message to. So I think that this is the way you can try to embrace this view that is more like multidimensional of communication, like through a human-centered approach. And I believe that information design is very powerful in that sense.
Yes, and maybe Espen, would you tell us about how you use information, or have collaborated and used design to communicate?
I can tell you a bit why we met up and done some work together. I work for the Norwegian Environment Agency, and this is the national focal point of the Ipcc, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change here in Norway. So we coordinate a lot of their work. We are not the experts writing the authors. It's Bjørn's colleagues doing that work. But we have two roles. One is the sort of the coordination of the scientific contribution, and it's also the communications part. And we try to, we have a role in communicating the findings of the Ipcc here in Norway to Norwegian policymakers and other audiences. But we're also trying to help the Ipcc with its communications capacity. So we are in close dialogue with the Secretariat in Geneva and so on. We try to support them. Some years ago, we helped them a lot in developing their first communication strategy, and we've continued to support their communications work for some years. A couple of years ago, we took an initiative to an expert meeting of the Ipcc here in Oslo about communications only. So we had about 60 or 70 people here in Oslo. They were a mix of scientists, Ipcc authors, and communications experts discussing how the Ipcc can develop its communications. And there was a report made from that. A lot of conclusions or advice was drawn up, and I have a copy here. I made 20 copies of a long list of advice. If you want a copy after, I can give it to you. Some of the advice was about communicating more clearly, both in terms of the writing and also in terms of the graphics. And I think if you have tried to look at the Ipcc reports, you have seen a lot of graphics, illustrations that are very, very difficult to understand. If you have a scientist who can spend 5 minutes explaining the graph for you, you will be amazed. and you will understand it, because it contains a lot of valuable information and it can tell a really good story. But if you're a non-expert, a non-scientist, it's very difficult to grasp it. So what we started out with was we had a project idea. We asked, how can we help the IPCC develop graphics that are slightly easier to understand while maintaining scientific integrity? Because there's a lot of information that has to go into some of these illustrations, for example, uncertainty intervals and so on. And you can't just end up, it's not possible to foresee an IPCC report containing only well-designed infographics, which is what Angela does. That's not where we can go, but we want to try to help the panel making the figures they use a bit easier to access and understand. So we tried to develop a best practice document, a guide for the scientists, and it's an ongoing work. We started in the fall. We didn't get where we wanted. We didn't have the resources that we needed. It's being continued now at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, because just before Christmas there was an article in Nature Climate Change based on work of a researcher who is doing his doctorate on how to improve climate graphics to make them a little bit easier to understand while maintaining scientific integrity. We didn't know about this. And because we didn't succeed with our project, then we asked them, will you pick up this ball and make sure that, and so we gave them some money and they're working on it, and they'll be working on it until the summer. And in June, we will probably, hopefully, present it to a group of IPCC authors. Yes. And Angela's been involved in the project.
Stage, yeah.
She was not the one with the lack of resources and ideas, I can tell you that. But yeah, she had a lot of
very
input,
interesting.
a lot of good input for that.
Yep.
So hopefully we will have a project in the summer.
Yeah. So Bjørn, would you like to tell us a bit of what you do and how you communicate?
At least I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges. I mean, I'm one of those strange beasts who's both a very active climate scientist. I contributed to the IPCC. I write my papers with all the horrible graphs in them and all that. But I'm also a very active disseminator. I'm in contact with the media several times a week. And I mean, they call me back because I've spent time trying to figure out how do you translate these horrible graphs into something that actually matters. Right, and this is not a God-given talent or anything like that. It's something just like anything else. It's something you practice at, and that's why we have the MNKOM course, which teaches exactly those things. But that's not the topic here today. Right? The question posed here was: has climate communication failed? No. Right? Come on. All right, we've known about this for some time, but climate change is now in every school book. Every school book ever. All of you in the audience today, even me, every kid today, they learn about climate change from grade 1. Right? Give it a few more years, and these elderly people who stick to their views that climate change is not real, they will, for one reason or another, not be here anymore, and we will have a whole generation of people who have learned about climate change in one form or another from their youth. Right? A little while back, we had the Paris Agreement on trying to tackle climate change, where more or less every country in the world decided that, yes, we have to try and stick within the 2-degree limit. Right? So the policymakers have gotten it, businesses have gotten it, right? All the people, and I apologize to the general public, but all the people who matter in the world have gotten it. Right? Okay, that's being a bit tough. But the reason I put it like that is that this has really been the focus of climate communication. Right? Communication has focused in on decision makers, policymakers, businesses, right? Of course, also to the general public. But that's really where this view that communication has failed, well, that's because we still have this backlash now and then from the general public saying, well, is this stuff real? Why do I have to do something? So I'm going to contend that climate change communication has not failed, but it has sinned, right? We, as communicators, have committed 3 very grave sins for a long time. The first sin, let me illustrate. It's almost Easter. What does every Norwegian do over Easter? Well, we go up to the mountains and we bring along a crime book, right? So here's a crime book, right? You buy your nice glossy book and you start reading, and you get a very nice setting. You get all the interesting characters. You get some character development. This person loves that person hates that person has money, all of that stuff, and then you put them in this scary place, right? Maybe in a cabin somewhere, and there's nasty weather, and you get really excited, and then the murder occurs, right? And then the book is over. It stops. There's no story. You've scared people. You've given them a lot of nice background. You made them understand what's going on, and then you stop. This might work once as a gimmick, but it doesn't work as a strategy for communicating something. But this is exactly what we've done in climate communication. We've told people how it works. We've told people what the culprit is, even, right? We know what causes climate change, etc., and we know that we should all be scared. That's been our main message, right? Tremble, people. Be scared, right? Your world is going to hell, right? That's almost been our message, right? So the only point where I give the climate skeptics credit is sometimes saying that we've been a bit alarmist. Not because I don't think we should be alarmed. We should definitely be alarmed, but running for fear, right? Using the fear argument or the fear virkemiddel effect.
Narrative,
That only works for so long. There is a whole story here. The full narrative is that, well, at the end of the 20th century, we started to realize that we had an issue. We needed to find some way of dealing with that issue while still bringing the world out of poverty, while eradicating this and this problem, while dealing with an elderly population, while dealing with disease, etc., etc. So we can put society together in this and this way. We can make this and this transformation to our energy systems. It can work with the economy like this and this and this. Now, today, we have this entire narrative. It can be presented, it will be presented in the next generation of Ipcc reports. We should have done this 20 years ago. Then you wouldn't have had this issue, because you could have seen, or at least it would have been much less of an issue, you could have seen the full narrative. This is the issue, this is what we can do about it. Norwegians are very scared about our oil, right? Should we develop oil? If you look at the actual narrative, and I'm not saying this because I'm a pretty big fan of further Norwegian oil exploration, but the Norwegian oil and gas industry are correct in saying that even within the 2-degree target, we can continue our activities for another 30, 40 years. That is the active work time of most people in this audience. We will have to change, but it's not a disaster, right? Climate change will be a disaster if you do nothing, but to do something, we can present this in a way that works. That is the major sin. We have not been telling the whole story. Right? We have 2 other sins, which I've spoken for a long time, so I'm going to be very, very quick, but just to give you my 3 sins. The second sin is that we have used the communication tools of maybe my old field, which is physics, where I talked about particles and quantum physics and gravity and whatnot. There you have to pull out all the stops. You have to do everything you can to make it simple, so that people can understand it if they don't have a university degree in physics. Climate, if you make it that simple, well, you make people understand, that's true. But once a skeptic shows up and gives something that sounds like a reasonable counter-argument, then you have a problem. That is exactly what's happened. There are some people who, over the last few months, have been very active in kind of bombarding the Norwegian media with what looks like very reasonable arguments. They're not. They're total bullshit. But it takes a little bit more than these very simple explanations that we have given to understand that. Right, so we've kind of, I wouldn't say oversimplified, because simplification is usually good, but you have to give the full spectrum sometimes, and we haven't really been good enough at that. So that's the second sin. And the third sin is really that we have tried to do everything ourselves. Climate is a broad societal issue. It cannot be communicated only by the climate scientists. We have to be active communicators, of course. But when, and again, an example, I faced our good old grand old man, Carl I. Hagen, on Dagsnytt 18 a while back. I was kind of okay. But then afterwards, his party and the people, they want Carly Hagen to face us climate scientists in debates all over the country. There's no way we can do that. That is not the correct way of doing it. You can't put full-fledged, very experienced politician versus your mumbling climate scientist. That is not the correct pairing. We are not the ones to do that communication. That has to be the other political parties, because it's in their interest. It's not our job to sell their political message. We have to convince them that the political message is that we need to tackle climate change, but we can't do it alone. We have been trying to do it alone. That's our third sin. So we haven't been telling the full story. We've been maybe oversimplifying somewhat too much, and we have been trying to go it alone. Those are our three sins. So it's not a failure, but we have sinned.
Thank you. But how do you see yourself building bridges between those different, like between politicians, all of them on the same side? But how do you do that? Like a politician may not know that much about climate change and the science behind it.
It's all a matter there, I think, of setting and context and defining your role. Right, this is something we give a whole lecture about in MNKOM. Right, what is your role as a science communicator? I mean, I've been to kind of the main meetings of some of the political parties where I've been asked to give kind of the core climate science. That's fine. Then that's what you do. Then you give the full story. But then in other settings, usually when the media calls, they want the science behind the latest extreme weather. For instance, why are we now seeing so much melting in the Arctic, which I'm talking to a journalist about just after this thing, right? And there, yes, I could give this journalist just that answer, but then consciously, I always try to connect it then to the bigger story. Think through it in advance. What's the science behind it? Who will it affect? This necessarily means I have to select some examples. Who will it affect? How can we deal with it? How will the world look in 50 years if we do this, if we don't do that? So again, it's about being prepared, and it's that one scary thing which scientists don't like to do. It's talking outside your field. Right? Yeah. If I were a classical scientist, then I should be talking about atmospheric aerosols only. Okay. I'll tell you all about the 2 figures that I produced for Ipcc AR5 on atmospheric aerosols. Very nice, very detailed figures. And that's the only thing you would get out of me. Right? The challenge is to make scientists dare to talk more broadly, because then we can get in dialogue. And then you can have these long conversations with the policymakers, with the businesses, with whatever, and then they understand the full context more and realize that they can actually come back later and ask more questions, and then you can move on. But having a dialogue with the scientist isn't always easy, I know.
And Espen, how do you feel that conversation works? You as a communication advisor, how does that conversation work as of now?
If I could pick up on some of the things that Bjørn said, I think, I mean, information or lack of information is certainly not the only challenge. I agree with what was said initially. I don't think our information effort, our effort to bring about knowledge and communicate it has failed. I mean, where would we be today if we hadn't done that effort? But it's not more information is not the only thing we have to do, because changing climate policy, getting better, more efficient climate policy and getting change is a lot about interest and trust. So and to gain trust, I mean it's my interests are not the same interests as some financial investors, people who have their money in fossil fuel industries and so on, and this is it's this fight between interests. That's where we have to look now, and how can communication help in those ways? And I think you have to get other people talking about climate change. When you have people like Tina Saltvedt, who's an oil analytic, talk about climate change to her colleagues, that's useful. If you can have cultural personalities who reach out to people who are not part of the cultural elite talk about climate change. I think that helps. So you have to engage more people, and you have to have more messengers. Climate scientists and politicians on the left side of politics cannot be the only people talking about this.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's very right what you said, that it's a collaborative effort. I mean, it's not, I kind of like empathize a lot with scientists. So hearing the 3 scenes of the scientists told by a scientist, it's like, okay, I feel sorry sometimes about scientists, because even the idea of, it is true that they have to, become maybe more skilled at communicating, but at the same time, it's not just their job. So I think it's the world is very complex, and if you think that very often we talk about denial. Maybe we'll talk later on about denial. And for the past 3-4 years, we are almost sorry for deniers. How do you manage to to unlock deniers and bring them out of the bubble? But if you think that there are deniers that actually don't understand, and that's why they are in denial, that's one thing. If you think that there are deniers that use denial as a political agenda, if you think about the current chief of the US EPA, Pruitt, I mean, I don't think he's a denier. I think he knows consciously how to use denial or how to use misinformation just to manipulate people. So we have to equip people with critical thinking. How do you manage to recognize good evidence and good science from misinformation? And it's a very complex matter where there is no one actor that can solve the problem. And as you say, we need, and we have actually people very active in many fields. So now we start seeing private investors wanting to almost invest in good projects that can be beneficial for the environment. So that's business, and we are seeing those things. So I think many positive things are happening. And then there are the media, obviously, the responsibility of the media. Now, finally, someone has said that it's morally unethical to have a person that communicate climate science and believe, obviously, in climate change, because it's evidence-based, that's the evidence, and a skeptic on the same round table. It's completely unethical when you have 97% of the scientific community agreeing on the same thing. Why should you do that? Why should you give space to misinformation if your task is informing the public? So I think there are so many multiple directions that, but definitely, the collaborative approach and being aware of all these channels is extremely important. Yeah.
When you work with scientists, is it hard for them to make them start thinking about visual design from the offset? Is it?
I think that scientists are surprisingly in love with design. They grasp the importance of design. They grasp the importance of communicating through different senses, through sight and through like verbal channels. What you might struggle with is the design process sometimes, and that's not a problem that concerns only the scientist. That's a problem that concerns every client, in my experience. So when you start talking with clients and you tell them that your first goal, usually people come to you and say, I want to design something and it has to look like that. So they come with a solution in mind. And that's the first mistake in general, because you cannot find a good solution unless you embrace the audience and unless you add this social aspect of communication within your strategy. So the design process is a little bit painful because you have to deal with uncertainty. okay, for a fairly long period of time. You cannot start with an idea in mind of what you want. As Espen said, scientists love accuracy and they want to be precise. Sometimes they would like to say everything, but they understand the power of, I don't want to call it simplification because I don't like that word, but I like to use the expression deconstructing complexity. So and they're very good at it if you facilitate the design process in the right way. And you have to remember that there isn't one communication, universal perfect communication in general. Everything depends on the context where the audience is, on the goal you want to achieve, on the time you have available, on the channels you have available. So it really depends on many different variables. But I guess in my experience working with scientists is extraordinary if you like challenges, and it's mutual, because I believe that yes, scientists should become better communicators, maybe, but designers should become much better at knowing and dealing with scientific processes. So you cannot expect that a scientist comes and commissions something to you, and then you deliver the final. That doesn't work, trust me. It doesn't work because you cannot reach that level of mastering the content that they have, and you need that in all the details, because you do so many stupid assumptions as a non-expert. So yeah.
But do you think that every project should have a designer, or should they be able to do it by themselves?
No, I profoundly believe after 15 years that every project should cater for collaboration between scientists or content expert and not graphic design agencies. I'm sorry, but people that are thinking in a design thinking way. That's why I like information design. It's very geared towards the design process. Yep. Okay, so we are not interested in beautiful, pretty results that look good, and then maybe you test them and nothing works. We are interested in the process, and I see that now also in business there is more and more attention to design processes. Because I think that there is the component of the human-centered component of design helps you to open up towards the receiver of the information, the producer of the information. That's why I think it's extremely successful. And I personally fell in love with information design because of that, because of this type of approach.
Espen first, and then Bjørn.
No, I just thought when you said that scientists love design, I thought it would be good to show an example. So if I could give me 1 second. Let's see if we can. Have you seen that? Some of you have probably seen this. Okay. I can briefly tell you the story. Maybe it should have been Bjørn because it's one of Bjørn's colleagues. But in any case, it started out with a scientist named Ed Hawkins, and he first made a graph that looks like this. Can you see that, kind of? So he draws the increasing annual temperature like lines, and then it's the years going up, so you can see the lines going higher and higher, or the temperature going higher and higher. And he showed this illustration to Jan Fuglestvedt, a research director at CICERO as well, and now part of the Ipcc bureau. And Jan was discussing this figure, this one, at the dinner table with his wife. And they thought, what if it goes into a spiral? What if December connects to January and goes in a circle? And he sent that proposal back to Ed Hawkins, and then he came back with this. So, I mean, scientists can be extremely creative, and many of them really, really want to, show their findings in an efficient way.
Absolutely.
Just to add that it took Ed Hawkins less than 2 hours to change his graph from linear to a circle. Less than 24 hours later, that thing had gone viral.
Yeah.
That was fire in dry grass.
That's very nice. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is that there's actually something interesting going on within science. Right? This is a sneak peek at what goes on at kind of the top level of climate science. We are getting very interested in design and good information communication in 2 very specific contexts. One is when we apply for money. We need the good figures to put in our applications. And the second is when we try to write papers for Nature or Science, because we know that the editors there also love good graphics. And that process actually produces some pretty good plots. Now this is very self-serving and nasty, right? But if you can get the drives behind those efforts, which actually does produce some pretty good results, and convert it into, make the scientists realize that communication is also self-serving in the same way, or at least it has some interest for them, then yes, there's a lot of momentum right now in good design, good communications within science. We just need to be able to turn it around into the public dissemination sphere as well, and I think that's really happening. So there's some good trends going on.
Yeah. Before we finish, we would like to open for questions from the audience. Do anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. My name is Carolina. First of all, I want to say thank you for coming. I am really interested about your work and admire it, so thank you. A while ago, I was watching NRK, and I saw a documentary on shipping and the shipping industry. And they were saying at the beginning that the shipping is not the information about shipping, the effects on environment, hasn't been communicated really well. People don't know the bad effects that it plays on climate change. And I was surprised that Norway, not so surprised because I knew about it, but surprised that Norway, being a country that supports and has really good approaches on climate change, has one of the biggest, or is the biggest country for shipping. So it plays one of the biggest effects, actually, in climate change. So I wanted to know what was your take on that, and how Norway as a country can improve that. So, thank you.
This is actually a very good example of where there is communication, but it is directed at other avenues than the public sphere, because there's actually a lot of research in Norway, also at CICERO, on the climate and environmental impacts of shipping. We have our group has a whole slew of atmospheric chemistry projects looking at, in particular, the unique impacts in the Arctic. And we had a big paper just a few years back on the difference, say, now, okay, the Arctic is melting. Can we maybe utilize that? Can you run the ships over the Arctic instead of going from Rotterdam to Yokohama all the way down by the Suez Canal? It cuts the travel time and travel distance in half, which really reduces the amount of fuel. So that's good, but then again, it goes through the pristine Arctic, which is not good. So what are the benefits? And the shipping industry themselves are very interested in this, because they realize that they are part of the whole picture, but both shipping and aviation as sectors are actually outside of the Paris Agreement and outside of all the major global agreements. They're kind of running their own deal. This is a case where scientists and the industry are really communicating more or less directly. But you're right, it hasn't really been communicated externally. It's kind of an opportunity that we have. Yeah, I don't know if there's a good reason why it hasn't been communicated that broadly, but maybe it's kind of a hard sell, I think, to journalists. Like anyone else, we are dependent on sexy stories to sell. It's a sad truth, but it's there.
Hi. You haven't said anything about open data or supporting the design processes in the background, and as science communicators, I often think that you make the mistake of actually trying to come up with solutions, which it shouldn't be the job of scientists, as far as I'm concerned.
Anyone?
I think maybe Bjørn is more experienced in that than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly aware that we can't do everything, and that there's a big drive towards open data and open analyses and open access, and I think everything that at least I and my group have published for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years has had all the data open, everything available. I don't think anyone has requested our data even once, even though these have been pretty high-profile papers. So some of it, except when you're in big collaboration networks. So that's one of the problems of the open science movement, is that it's great for everything to be open. The problem is for someone to actually have the time and effort to really actually look at it. But for things to be open is, of course, the first step. And then of course there's actually one case. We had the Global Weirding project. If you look at globalweirding.is or .com or whatever, it's globalweirding.is/here is here. It's a project that we had with the Bengler design group or design company a year or 2 back, funded by the Nordisk Ministerråd, where we looked at kind of these future projections and tried to make some of these possible scenarios, like a global breakdown in nuclear power because their coolant water intake is clogged by moneter. What is it in English? Jellyfish, which could be an issue. All these kind of strange news where things lock together. There we used freely open model projections and open scenarios and whatever. And the design group they didn't have to get all that from us. They could go in and pull everything out because things were available. So that's also certainly a good trend. It's maybe not the best example, but at least it's one that we have.
Yes, Erik Nein from Department of Teacher Education and School Research. I think well, first of all, I think that climate scientists are doing a tremendous job in a kind of difficult climate, so to say. But you mentioned the school, and I wondered what would be the kind of main ideas about science. I mean, when you communicate the results and what they mean, their significance, would it also be possible to relate that to a story about how science works? And what would you say is the main ideas about how science works that the public would need to understand?
That's a very good point.
I just have an experience as then you can jump in if you want.
Yeah.
But we collaborate with the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. We have been collaborating with them for 5-6 years. And we actually try to equip the students with the tools so they can recognize or can assess the reliability of health claims. And I think it's a very, very close, I would say, strategy that could be very easily applied to climate change, because the kids have to understand the scientific process, so they are guided through a journey, and they become health researcher. And by becoming equipped with these tools to recognize the reliability of health claims, obviously, they also become very skilled at understanding what is, what type of information they can accept or they should accept, and what type of information they should reject. So I think that, in my opinion, education is, as you said in the very beginning, education is probably the top priority we should have. Equipping kids and creating teaching materials for teachers to teach the kids that would be an extraordinary strategy, and definitely applicable to climate science as well. And I think that there is a lot going on. The other thing is that I think also in like more like learning environment, there is a lot of science and a lot of research on how to develop critical thinking, for example. I think we should look at that stuff much more, in the same way we should try to look at the science of communicating science. So we focus a lot on science communication, but nobody talks a lot about the science of communicating science. And there is a lot of scientific research done that can help.
I agree, and I think it's as you propose, is a perfect strategy for teaching the whole history of science. There's actually a book called The Discovery of Global Warming by Spencer Wert, who's a historian of science, which I think does that. I mean, it's aimed at adults, so it's not a school book, but it really does this very nice pedagogical way. It really uses the concepts of science. But one particular aspect, which I think is very useful, is to... It's one example of those cases where you have to separate what science says from your preconceptions. Because one of the issues we have when communicating climate science is that everyone feels that they know something about it. Because we've all experienced the weather for a long time, and for all these years that we've been born. So the first thing you have to say is that, well, sorry, but that really... usually isn't very relevant, because you have to do very systematic observations, and your memory is wrong, and it's too short, and you haven't been here for 150 years, and all these kind of things. It doesn't matter that it snowed last Wednesday, right? Even though it's March. So and that is a particular problem with school kids, because I mean, what school teaches really, which is a good thing, is trying to start with your mind and think. Yes, that's a perfect start. But sometimes your mind will deceive you. And this is one of the cases where this will quickly lead you in the wrong direction. So yes, I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Well, what we discovered, especially with kids, is that kids, they obviously are more open to accept good science, because they don't have many preconceptions. Yeah. It's much more difficult to teach the teachers how to teach the kids if they want to guide us, for example, through the understanding of the scientific process. So initially, I remember when we were designing learning materials for kids, we were focusing on the kids. Then we discovered that the gatekeeper are the teachers. So there is a lot of potential, I think, in education, and how you tackle, how you create, how you co-design the material with teachers and kids to make it successful. Yeah.
Teachers are the key.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for coming, and hope you come to the next MNKOM lunch. Thank you for our discussion.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting. Thanks.